Every night after the office became quiet and dark and everyone had gone home, there was one person still walking in the halls with slow steps and tired eyes. He was the janitor. His name was Tom, and no one really noticed him. He wore the same uniform every day and carried a big ring of keys that jingled when he walked. He never talked much, and he always kept his head down. People passed him in the hallway, but they never stopped to ask how he was. He just cleaned and swept and carried out the trash like he was invisible. But someone was watching. Rachel, the CEO of the company, worked late hours too. She had built this business from the ground up, and now she sat at the top of the tallest floor with the biggest office and the best view of the city. Rachel was sharp and proud and strong, and people respected her because she was smart and never made mistakes. At least, that's what they believed. One night Rachel was walking down the hallway with her tablet in her hand when she saw Tom at the end of the hallway. He was wiping down the vending machine and humming softly to himself. There was something calm about him, something sad, but peaceful like a song with no words. Rachel stopped and watched him for a moment. She had never really looked at him before. He was older than she thought, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with gray in his hair and lines on his face. His eyes looked tired but kind. She turned away and went back to her office, but the image stayed in her mind. That night she stayed later than usual, and when she left she passed Tom again. He was mopping the lobby floor near the glass doors. He nodded to her politely and moved aside to let her pass. She smiled back, but something made her pause. Tom pulled a small photo out of his pocket and looked at it for a long time before putting it back. Rachel saw it only for a second, but she could tell it was a picture of a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with curly hair and a bright smile. Rachel got into her car, but her thoughts didn't leave. Why did he carry that photo in his pocket? Why did he stay so late every night? Did he have family at home, or was he all alone? She had thousands of employees, and she didn't know anything about this man who worked so hard and said so little. The next day, Rachel asked her assistant who the janitor was. The assistant said his name was Tom, and he had been working here for almost 3 years. Always on time, never missed a shift, never complained. Rachel nodded and walked away, but her curiosity only grew. That night, she stayed late again. She sat in her office, pretending to work, but her mind was somewhere else. At around 10 o'clock, she heard the sound of keys and footsteps outside her door. She peeked out and saw Tom pushing his cleaning cart down the hallway. She watched as he worked his way through each floor like a quiet ghost, never making a sound. Finally, around midnight, Tom left the building through the side exit. Rachel followed. She didn't know why she was doing it. Maybe she felt guilty for not knowing more about the people who worked under her. Maybe she just wanted to understand who he was. She got in her car and drove slowly behind him, keeping her distance. He didn't take a bus or drive a car. He walked. He walked for blocks and blocks past stores and restaurants and dark alleyways. He walked with his head down and his hands in his pockets. Rachel stayed far behind, but close enough to keep him in sight. After almost 30 minutes, he stopped at a small corner store and went inside. Through the glass window, she saw him buy a carton of milk and a loaf of bread. He counted his coins carefully at the counter. Rachel felt something in her chest that she didn't understand. He didn't act like someone who was just doing a job. He acted like someone who was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. After he left the store, he walked a few more blocks and then turned into a narrow alley with a steep stairwell on the side of a laundromat. He climbed up slowly and disappeared into the building. Rachel parked across the street and looked up at the small window on the second floor. A light flicked on inside, and she saw a little girl run to hug him. He picked her up with both arms and spun her around as she laughed. Rachel sat in her car in silence, watching the scene. She had no words. Everything she thought she knew about Tom had changed in that moment. He was not just a janitor. He was a father. And maybe, just maybe, he was the strongest person she had ever seen. Rachel could not sleep that night. She lay in her big soft bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she had seen. The image of Tom holding his daughter in that tiny apartment would not leave her mind. The room was small and dim, And there were no toys or furniture, just a blanket on the floor and a small lamp on the nightstand. But still there was love. She had seen it in the way the girl ran to him, and the way he smiled even though his eyes looked so tired. Rachel kept asking herself why she had never noticed before. Why no one in the company had ever really looked at him. He came in every day, cleaned every floor, and left without a word. But now he was the only person she could think about. The next day, she sat at her desk and looked out the window. Her office was high above the city, with glass walls and expensive chairs and a shelf full of awards. She had everything. Yet something inside her felt empty. She picked up her phone and called her assistant. She asked her to bring Tom's file again. His name was Thomas L. Reeves. Age 51. Widowed. Single parent. No formal complaints ever filed. No vacation days used in the last year. She sat quietly staring at the words on the paper. There was no mention of his past, no sign of what had brought him here. She knew she had to learn more. Rachel made a decision. She would follow him again. Not because she wanted to spy, but because she needed to understand. Not just who he was, but how a man like that could go unseen for so long. That evening she stayed late once more. She sat at her desk with the lights off, watching the building slowly grow quiet. People left one by one, turning off their computers and saying goodnight. Then came the soft sound of keys and wheels. Tom was there again, moving from floor to floor, pushing his cart and cleaning without a sound. Rachel waited until she saw him leave through the side door. Then she followed again, staying a good distance behind. This time she brought a notebook. She didn't know why. Maybe it was just a habit from her early days, when she used to take notes on everything that mattered. Tom walked the same path as before, past the dark alleys and shuttered shops. But this time he stopped in front of a small brick building with a sign that said Community Shelter. He opened the door and went inside. Rachel parked and walked across the street and peeked through the glass. Inside, Tom was placing small bags of food on a table. Other people were there too, some homeless, some hungry, some just tired. He greeted each person with a smile and handed out food like it was normal, like it was just part of his day. He wasn't just helping them. He was making them feel human. Rachel's chest felt tight again. She had never seen anything like it. After an hour, he left and continued walking. He stopped once more at a library where he picked up a few children's books from a drop box and placed them in his backpack. Then he walked home and climbed those same narrow stairs. Rachel sat in her car, watching as the light turned on. The little girl hugged him again. He opened one of the books and began to read to her using funny voices and big gestures that made her laugh. Rachel smiled through the window. Something warm stirred inside her. This man, who had so little, was giving so much. She looked at her notebook and began to write down everything she had seen. She did not know what she would do with it yet, but she knew one thing. She could not forget this night. The next morning, Rachel walked into her office early, before anyone else arrived. She stared at the company mission statement on the wall. Words like leadership, growth, and excellence were written in gold letters. But what about kindness? What about heart? She picked up her pen and made a list. She wrote Tom's name at the top, and underneath it she wrote words like strength, humility, sacrifice, and love. She looked at the list for a long time. Then she made a plan. She called the HR department and asked for more details about Tom's background. She asked if he had ever been offered other roles or training. They said no. He had never asked for anything. Rachel asked for his emergency contact. It was blank. She hung up and sat back in her chair thinking. No one had ever looked. Not really. But she was looking now. And she was not going to stop. Not until she found a way to give back what he had given to everyone else. Even if he never asked for it. Even if he didn't want help. Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who say the least. And sometimes it takes just one person to notice before everything begins to change. The next evening, Rachel did not wait in her office. She waited outside in her car across the street from the building. She had made sure to leave the office before Tom, so he would not see her. The sky was cloudy and gray, and the wind was cool as she sat quietly with the engine off and her notebook on her lap. She felt strange doing this, but something inside her told her to keep going. This wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about learning the truth. Not just about Tom, but about the life he was hiding from the world. After almost an hour, she saw him come out of the side door, carrying his backpack as usual. He wore the same uniform and walked the same path. Slow, steady, quiet. Rachel followed at a safe distance. He turned corners and crossed streets without ever looking back. Soon he reached the same small store and went inside just like before. Through the window, Rachel watched him pick up eggs and a bottle of milk. He counted his coins again and gave the cashier a small smile. Then he walked out and headed toward the laundromat. Rachel followed him past the shops and the cracks in the sidewalk. She parked in the same spot as last time and waited. Tom climbed the stairs with slow steps and disappeared behind the metal door. A light turned on in the small window above. Rachel looked up and saw movement inside. This time, she stayed longer. She watched as Tom set down the food and hugged the little girl again. They sat on the floor next to a small plastic table with two stools that didn't match. The walls were bare and the paint was old and peeling in places. There was a small heater in the corner and a pile of folded clothes stacked neatly beside a suitcase. No television, no toys, no sofa. Rachel wrote it all down in her notebook. Then she saw something that stopped her breath. Tom pulled out a sheet of paper and handed it to the girl. She smiled brightly and ran to a backpack by the wall. She pulled out a small pencil case and sat down to do her homework. Tom sat beside her and pointed to the words on the page, helping her sound them out slowly with patience and care. Rachel could see how tired he was. He rubbed his eyes more than once and leaned back, as if his back hurt from hours of standing. But he never stopped smiling at his daughter. The girl laughed when she got a word right, and Tom clapped his hands softly to cheer her on. Rachel felt her throat tighten as she watched them. This was not just a man working hard to survive. This was a father giving everything he had for his child. He was teaching her, loving her, protecting her. Even in a place that looked like it had nothing, they still had each other. And that was everything. Rachel sat back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her own childhood. She had grown up in a big house with warm meals and soft beds and vacations every summer. Her parents had worked hard, but they had never gone without. Now here was Tom living in a room barely big enough for two, and still finding a way to smile. Rachel opened her eyes and looked at the window again. Tom was now braiding his daughter's hair, while she held a small teddy bear with one eye missing. He did it gently like he had done it 1,000 times before. Rachel picked up her pen and wrote one sentence in big letters across the page. "This man is not invisible." She tapped the notebook with her fingers, thinking about what came next. She could not just watch anymore. She had to do something. She did not know what yet, but she knew she would find a way. This was not just a story to her now. This was a life. And it mattered. The next day at work, Rachel walked through the halls and looked at people differently. She wondered how many other stories she had missed while chasing deadlines and reading reports. How many people had she passed in the hallway without seeing their pain? She stopped by the janitor's closet and looked inside. It was small and crowded with brooms and buckets and old supplies. A single chair sat in the corner beside a thermos and a half-eaten sandwich. Rachel stood there for a long time just looking. Then she turned and walked back to her office with a new sense of purpose. She knew the next step would be hard, but she also knew she was ready. Ready to ask the right questions, ready to listen, and most of all, ready to change something. Because the man who cleaned her floors every night was teaching her more than any business book ever had. Rachel woke up early the next morning with a different feeling in her heart. She felt like something had shifted inside her, something she could not ignore anymore. She got ready quickly and arrived at the office before the sun came up. The building was quiet and dark, and the air felt heavy with silence. She sat at her desk and opened Tom's file again. She read every line slowly. It still said the same things. Janitor since 3 years. No write-ups. No vacation taken. No complaints. But no story either. Nothing about who he really was. Rachel leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. She knew there had to be more. She picked up the phone and called the HR manager. Her voice was calm but firm. She asked if there were any older records on Tom. Anything before he joined the cleaning staff. The manager hesitated, then said they had something in storage from his first job application. Rachel asked her to bring it right away. When the envelope arrived, it was thick and dusty. Rachel opened it with care. Inside were papers filled out in neat handwriting. Rachel read the top line and her eyes widened. Tom had a degree in mechanical engineering from a good college. He had worked as a junior engineer for 5 years at a company across town. She flipped through the pages. There were letters of recommendation, certificates, old photos of him in a white lab coat standing next to machines. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the last page. There it was. A letter written by Tom himself explaining why he had left his last job and applied to be a janitor. Rachel read the words slowly. His wife had died in a car accident. She had been driving home from work on a rainy night when a truck ran a red light. Their daughter was only 2 years old at the time. Tom had no family nearby and no one to help with childcare. He tried to keep working, but the long hours and daycare costs made it impossible. He quit everything to raise his daughter. He applied to many jobs that could allow him to work part-time or during night shifts, but no one wanted to hire an overqualified engineer for entry-level positions. After months of searching, he accepted the janitor role because it allowed him to be home during the day and work at night. He wrote that he was grateful for the chance, even if it was not his dream job. Rachel sat in silence, with the letter in her hand and tears in her eyes. This man had lived a whole life before he became invisible to everyone around him. She thought about all the times she had walked past him without a second glance. All the times people had joked about janitors or talked down to them without knowing anything. She felt ashamed. But more than that, she felt determined. She picked up her phone again and called the head of operations. She asked if there were any open positions that matched Tom's past experience. The voice on the other end said they were looking for someone to help manage the building systems and repair equipment. A technical job with better pay and flexible hours. Rachel asked them to send her the details immediately. She spent the next hour reading over the position requirements and adjusting the schedule so it would work with Tom's life as a single dad. She wanted this offer to be perfect. Something fair and something earned. Not a favor, not charity, but a real chance. The kind of chance most people never get once they fall through the cracks. Later that day, Rachel stood by the window and watched the city below. She wondered how many other Toms were out there. People with stories hidden behind tired eyes and quiet smiles. People who carried the weight of the world, but never said a word. She didn't know what Tom would say when she offered him the new role. He might say no. He might feel proud or unsure or even scared. But Rachel knew she had to try. That evening, she stayed late again. This time, she did not sit in her office or follow him home. She waited by the front desk with an envelope in her hand. When Tom walked through the lobby, pushing his cart, he looked surprised to see her. Rachel smiled and asked if he had a moment to talk. He nodded slowly and set the cart aside. She handed him the envelope and said she had learned about his past, and she believed he had more to offer than anyone had ever seen. Tom looked confused at first, then opened the envelope and read the job description inside. His hands shook slightly, and his eyes filled with something between disbelief and quiet hope. Rachel said the job was his if he wanted it. She promised it would not take time away from his daughter, and it would come with full benefits and better hours. Tom said nothing for a long time. Then he looked at her with eyes full of emotion. And for the first time, he smiled the kind of smile that comes from someone who finally feels seen. Tom stood in the lobby with the envelope in his hand and his heart beating fast. He looked down at the papers again and read the words slowly just to make sure he had not misunderstood. Rachel stood in front of him calm and kind and waiting for his answer. He wanted to speak, but the words would not come out right away. He was not used to being the center of attention, and definitely not used to someone believing in him. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded, once then twice then said thank you in a quiet voice. Rachel smiled and told him to take his time and think it over and let her know the next day. Tom said he would. That night, as he walked home with his backpack a little lighter and his steps a little faster, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. When he reached the laundromat, he climbed the stairs and opened the door. His daughter ran to him, as always, and hugged him tightly. He held her close, but this time his arms felt stronger and his mind felt clearer. He told her he had something to share and sat down beside her. He showed her the paper and tried to explain in simple words. "It means Daddy got a new job," he said. She looked at the paper and then at him and asked if that meant he would be home more during the day. "Yes," he said, "and also we might be able to move to a nicer place, soon maybe with your own room and a real bed and even some toys." Her eyes grew wide and she smiled so big it made Tom's heart ache with joy. She hugged him again and told him she was proud of him. Tom could barely hold back his tears, but he smiled and said he was proud of her too. He knew that everything he had done so far had been for her, and now maybe things were about to change. The next day, Tom arrived at work early for the first time since he started as a janitor. He knocked gently on Rachel's office door and stepped inside, holding the envelope. Rachel stood up to greet him and asked if he had made a decision. Tom looked at her with steady eyes and said yes, he wanted to accept the offer. Rachel smiled wide and shook his hand and said she was glad and she believed it was the right time for a new beginning. Tom started his new position the following week. He learned quickly and worked hard and even helped improve things in the building that no one had noticed before. He fixed old systems, made things more efficient, and trained other workers with patience and care. People started talking about him in a different way. They asked for his advice and listened to what he had to say. He was no longer the quiet janitor people passed in the hallway. He was now a leader in his own way. Rachel watched all of this quietly with a proud heart. But she was not finished yet. She had one more idea. She decided to tell Tom's story at the next company meeting. With his permission, of course. At first he hesitated, because he was not used to attention, and he still felt shy around big crowds. But Rachel said it might inspire others and help them see things differently. Tom agreed, and together they worked on what she would say. The day of the meeting, the whole company gathered in the main hall. People chatted and laughed and looked at their phones until Rachel stepped onto the stage and asked for silence. She began to speak slowly and clearly, telling the story of a man who had worked quietly in the background for years without anyone really knowing who he was. She told them about the sacrifices he had made and the love he showed every day to his daughter and to others who had even less than he did. She did not say his name until the end. When she finally said, "Tom, please stand," everyone turned and looked as Tom rose slowly from his seat. The room was silent for a few seconds, then people began to clap. It started softly, then grew louder and louder until the sound filled the whole room. Some people stood up and others wiped their eyes. Tom looked around the room and felt something new, something deep and strong and peaceful. He felt seen. He felt valued. He felt like he belonged. After the meeting, many people came to shake his hand and thank him. Some even told him he had reminded them of their own fathers or brothers or friends who had struggled in silence. Tom smiled and listened and thanked them with honest words. That night when he went home, he sat with his daughter and told her everything. She hugged him and said she always knew he was a hero. And for the first time in a long time, Tom believed it too. The company felt different after that meeting. People walked a little slower and looked each other in the eye more often. There were more smiles, more kind words, more questions, like, "How are you?" instead of "What's the deadline?" It was as if Tom's story had opened a window and let fresh air into the building. Rachel noticed the change right away. In the elevator, people who had never spoken before were having real conversations. In the break room, employees were sitting together instead of staring at their screens alone. Even the hallway, where Tom used to mop every night, felt brighter somehow. Tom continued in his new job, with the same quiet strength as before. He arrived early, fixed what was broken, and helped wherever help was needed. He trained a new group of staff members and taught them not just how to repair machines, but also how to care for people. He still wore simple clothes and kept the photo of his daughter in his pocket. But now people saw him for who he really was. Not just a worker, but a teacher, a father, a man with wisdom and heart. One morning, Rachel called Tom into her office again. She asked him to sit and handed him another envelope. This one was not about a job or a promotion. It was a letter from a scholarship foundation. Rachel had quietly submitted an application for his daughter using the notes she had taken during the nights she followed him. It explained who Tom was and what kind of future he was building for his child. The letter said the scholarship had been approved. His daughter would be able to attend one of the best private schools in the city with full tuition and even supplies and books. Tom looked at the letter for a long time. His hands trembled as he read the words again and again. He looked up at Rachel and tried to speak, but his voice broke. She smiled and placed a hand on his arm and said this was just the beginning. That night, Tom walked home with tears in his eyes and his daughter's favorite snack in his hand. When he told her the news, she screamed with joy and hugged him so tightly he almost dropped the food. They danced around their tiny apartment and laughed until their cheeks hurt. Later they sat on the floor, and Tom told her stories about her mother. Stories he had been saving for a moment just like this. The next morning, they walked together to the new school building and stood in front of the tall doors. Tom knelt beside her and fixed her hair and said she was ready. He said he believed in her, just like Rachel had believed in him. His daughter hugged him tightly, then walked through the doors with a brave smile. Tom watched her go with tears in his eyes, not of sadness, but of pride. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Rachel kept her promise to make kindness a part of the company's mission. She started a new program called Stories That Matter, where employees could share their journeys, their struggles, their wins. Once a month, a different worker was invited to speak, and every time people listened. Real listening, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Tom was invited to speak again, but this time he asked if his daughter could join him. She stood beside him on stage, holding his hand, and told everyone that her dad was her hero. She said he was strong and gentle and funny and brave, and even when things were hard, he never gave up. The room was silent again, not because people were bored, but because they were moved. After the event, people came up to her and said she reminded them of hope. Rachel stood at the back of the room with a full heart. She looked at Tom and his daughter and thought about the first night she saw him looking at that photo. She remembered the dark stairwell, the tiny apartment, the soft voice reading bedtime stories on a floor with no furniture. And now here they were standing under bright lights in front of hundreds of people, not as a janitor and his daughter, but as a symbol of strength and love. Rachel walked out into the cool evening air and looked up at the sky. The stars were just beginning to show, and the city lights were glowing below. She felt something she had never felt before, not pride, not power, not even success. She felt peace. Because in a world full of numbers and charts and deadlines, she had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes you do not lead by being loud or perfect or rich. Sometimes you lead by caring, by noticing, by seeing someone who thought no one ever would. And that small act can change everything.